it's time for another Jane and Betty story. And this, Oh, I'm terribly apologetic about that. It's actually a Sam and Bernard story, isn't it? And this adventure is called Sam and Bernard and the Native Hen. Now, you shall find out what a native hen is later on in the tale. But for the time being, we open our story on a beautiful Saturday morning, right in the middle of autumn. Sam and Bernard had got up and were having breakfast with Mum. And Mum was talking about the fact that she needed some letters picking up from the post office at Kickatinalong, a little town down on the flats. Now, Sam and Bernard weren't quite old enough up until that point to ride down on their bikes to pick up the post. But today, Sam said, "Mum, I think Bernard and I are big enough and strong enough now to ride on our bikes down into Kickatinalong, pick up the post, and come home and deliver it for you." And Sam and Bernard's mum was very proud. She said, "That would be wonderful, boys, if you would do that for me. That would save your dad so much work." Because otherwise Dad had to hop on the horse and he'd lose an hour's work on the farm. So that's what they did. Now they said, "Mum, we want to go down to Kickatinalong along the Murdering Gully Road." And Sam, ever the inquisitive one, said to Mum, "Mum, why is it called Murdering Gully?" And their mum explained that many years ago an old bushman was found dead right on the creek in Murdering Gully, just at the bridge. And that's why they called the creek Dead Man's Creek. Yeah. And Sam thought this was great. Bernard said to Sam, "Sam, it probably never happened. It's probably not true." And Mum just smiled. Anyway, they got themselves ready. They got their bikes out and checked the chains and pumped up the tyres. Now, I should explain that Sam and Bernard's bikes were not like the bikes we have today. They didn't have beautiful, soft seats, lovely wide tyres and good brakes and suspension to make everything soft. No, Sam and Bernard's bikes were heavy, made of steel. And they were bone shakers. They were just rattlers. And of course all the roads were gravel, so they rattled along. But Sam and Bernard were strong young men, and they could ride a long way on their bone shakers. So Sam got his potato sack backpack out, and it consisted of a brown, rough Hessian potato sack with an old rubber inner tube slung across the front, and they carried a drink, some sandwiches, and a thermos of tea that their mum had made for them in the sack. Then they were ready to go. So 9:30, and down they went, down the farm, through the gate, along South Road, and South Road meandered along the ridge until they came to a little side turning. And at that side turning was a little sign, tiny little white sign with an arrow, and it was kind of leaning off to one side, and a bit bruised and battered and dirty, and it had moss growing on it. And it said, Murdering Gully. Sam said to Bernard, "Is it down this way, Bernard?" And Bernard said, "Yep, that's the way." So down they went, zooming down these beautiful sweeping bends. And they got to the bottom, and sure enough, there's a little bridge there over Dead Man's Creek. And as they rode over it, Sam got a little shiver, a little frisson over his body, and he thought, "Oh, Dead Man's Creek." Anyway, they kept riding, and by 11 o'clock they were in Kickatinalong. They went to the post office, picked up Mum's mail, then they went down to the general store. They had their lunch there on the veranda, and as a special treat, Mum had given them a penny each. That's like a little tiny little coin that's a tiny bit of money. And they bought some ice cream, because the general store there had just got a refrigerator in, and they sold little blocks of ice cream, and Sam and Bernard thought it was beautiful. So they enjoyed their ice cream, had a bit more of a break, talked to some of the kids which they knew from school, then they set off back along the road towards Murdering Gully. Along the way, in the distance, Sam saw a native hen. Now, a native hen is a bird, browny green colour, about this big, And there are two very important things about native hens you need to know. Firstly, they are dumb. They are the stupidest bird ever in existence. Chickens are like Einstein, like Albert Einstein in comparison to native hens. Sam and Bernard knew about Albert Einstein because their mother had studied about the theory of general relativity. Even though it was the 1920s, she was up with things. But I digress. Now, this native hen was running along the road in front of them. And every time Sam and Bernard would catch up to the native hen would run on fast and get ahead, about 100 yards ahead. Then it would slow down, and Sam and Bernard, on their rattlers, would catch up to the native hen. And then the native hen would look around, get scared, and run on. And this happened time after time after time. And Sam said to Bernard, why is this native hen not just running off to one side, into the paddocks, or through the blackberries, just to get out of our way? And Bernard said, we knew, Sam, that native hens are the dumbest creature on God's earth, and here is why. So, Sam thought this was most incredible, but after another couple of miles, just as they got near Murdering Gully, the native hen got more and more and more exhausted, so it would run on only about 10 yards, then 5 yards, and pretty soon Sam and Bernard could see that this native hen was completely worn out. And then the most amazing thing happened. Do you know what? This native hen just lay down and died right then and there. It had a heart attack and died. Well, and you'll never guess where it died. It died right beside Dead Man's Creek. Sam thought this was absolutely incredible. He got off his bike and he checked the native hen. Sure enough, no pulse, dead as a doornail. So he grabbed the native hen, put it in his sack to take it home and show Dad. Thought it was a fantastic adventure. So anyway, up they went, pedalled up Murdering Gully Road, along the South Road and back home. Now they got home pretty early, about 2 o'clock, and Mum gratefully received the letters. She thanked them very much and asked them whether they enjoyed their ice cream, and boy they had. She gave them a drink of lemonade, and then they went down to the shed to find Dad and show him the native hen. So they told Dad all about this native hen running up the road, and their dad wasn't surprised because he knew that native hens couldn't fly, they could only run, and he knew they were dumb. But what did surprise their dad was the fact that this native hen lay down and died right on Dead Man's Creek. Well, their dad, who was a bit of a trickster, decided to just play a bit of a trick on Sam and Bernard. So he said, real serious to Sam and Bernard, do you know, guys, there are 3 things about native hens you need to know. The first thing is they're stupid, and they nodded. The second thing, they can't fly, they nodded. And the third thing is they are beautiful, gorgeous to eat. So Sam and Bernard said, well, can we cook him up this afternoon, have him for tea? And Dad said, sure can. So he got a big kerosene tin, a big tin about this, by that high, and he lit a big fire, put some water in the tin. He plucked the feathers off the bird and gutted it and dressed it, and he put the bird in the boiling water to cook it. Then he put 4 big boulders, kind of big rocks, in the water too. And Sam and Bernard said, why are you doing that, Dad? And their father said, oh, it helps the bird cook. So Sam and Bernard thought, all right. So tea time came around and their dad said, righto, it's had 4 hours cooking, should be fine now. So he lifted it off the stove, off the fire with his gloves, tipped out the water, and he got 4 plates and he put them on the kitchen table. And on each of the plates, he put a rock. Got these gloves, picked up a rock and put a hot rock on each plate. And then he picked up the bird and he grabbed it and he threw it into the bush as far as he could. And Sam and Bernard said, Dad, why are you throwing away the bird? And Sam and Bernard's dad said, well, when you cook a native hen, you cook it with rocks, throw away the bird and eat the rocks, because the bird is terrible to eat. And that's the story of Sam and Bernard and the native hen, and how they learnt that native hens can't fly, they're stupid, and you can't eat them. to save your life.